Okay, good. I was going to say good morning, everybody, but it's now good afternoon. So I've got 5 minutes, so I'll just try and make the points that I want to make as succinctly as possible. So first of all, we do know that Ireland saw very high income growth between the mid-1990s and the mid-2000s. That's been well documented. But a key question about that rapid income growth was the extent to which it has been shared across the population. And just to go to the OECD official figures, they show that in the mid-2000s, income inequality in Ireland was just above the OECD average. So we were more unequal than the average. But in fact, that had improved from the 1980s. And we heard this morning about the crisis in the 1980s. And the official information does show that everybody benefited to some extent, and I think this would concur with our own knowledge that we did have high employment rates and increases in social welfare. So everybody did improve their income to some extent over that period. But we also know that incomes at the upper end of the income distribution do tend to be underreported. And so that even though most people did increase their incomes to some extent, those at the very top end experienced a proportionally greater increase. And the ESRI researchers have estimated that there were extraordinarily high income growth in incomes, but really only at the very top of the income distribution at kind of between 1% and 0.5% of the very top people. The OECD also undertook a large comparative study of income inequality, which they published in 2008, and they've made a number of pertinent observations. In general, the incomes of the richest 10% of people is generally 9 times greater than that of the poorest. And the gap in Ireland is actually just less than this, taking into account, obviously, the underreporting at the higher end. But the official statistics show that. And the OECD has observed growing inequalities across countries. So Ireland's not unusual in that regard. And when we heard about the contribution of this to the crash earlier across developed economies. But the OECD have given 3 reasons for increasing income inequalities across countries. These are, first of all, changing demography. Secondly, labour market developments. And thirdly, redistribution issues. To talk about the demographic factors, these include that there are now more older people in our populations, fewer people of working age, and more lone parents. But these factors are currently less of a problem actually in Ireland because we don't have the same ageing issue just yet. The OECD has cited developments in the labour market as the main reason for changes in income distributions, and these are largely driven by the growing disparities between low-paid and highly paid workers, and we have seen some evidence of this in Ireland. The third factor is redistribution, taking place through changes in taxes and benefits policies. And the situation in Ireland here has been complex. Until the recession, benefits have been increasing and taxes reducing. But it's important to look at other drivers of inequality in the redistribution areas. And these include things like tax reliefs, which benefit those on higher incomes, and indirect taxes such as VAT and excise duties, which have a greater impact on those on lower incomes. Another factor is wealth, and that was mentioned this morning. And wealth comprises financial assets such as savings, stocks and shares, and pensions, and then non-financial assets such as property, businesses, vehicles, and collectibles, art, and so on. And these are not included in the Irish income inequality statistics. But from the OECD and other analysis, we know that the distribution of wealth is much more unequal than the distribution of income. On the other hand, the benefits of things like public services such as education, health and housing provision are distributed much more equally than income. So those 2 factors are worth holding as we look about what we should do next. I just want to say a few words on the implications of the high levels of income inequality. And there are a number of reasons why these income inequalities matter. Firstly, people make comparisons with others around them, so that their relative income does matter for how people feel about themselves and their place in society. Secondly, we know from other surveys about asking people about income inequalities, and in fact, TASC do that themselves, that people do care about the distribution of income in society. People worry about falling into poverty, losing their job, and they want to live in societies that they believe to be fair. Thirdly, large income inequalities in general are related to high levels of poverty, unemployment, and low-paid jobs, which is bad for the economy, for individuals, their families and communities, and also for society as a whole. And fourthly, more equal societies tend to have higher levels of social cohesion. In their book that many of you may be familiar with, The Spirit Level, Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett provide evidence to show that more equal societies almost always do better. For example, they show that societal problems such as ill health, lack of community life, violence, drugs, obesity, mental illness, long working hours, big prison populations are more likely to occur in less equal societies. And an important point that they make is that the effects of inequality are not just confined to the least well off, but that they actually affect the vast majority of the population. So how is this relevant to the current economic and social context, where we have a recession and a large budget deficit? The key point I want to make here is the importance of understanding the drivers and the consequences of income inequality, and to keep this perspective in mind as part of our longer-term strategies while dealing with the very short-term and necessary responses. And a long-term, more equal society therefore should be a guiding yardstick. So just to flag a few potential responses which people may want to pick up in more detail in the discussion. Over the years and recently, TASC has articulated a number of positions relevant to the consideration of potential responses. They're succinctly captured in a recent report on addressing Ireland's five-part crisis by combining retrenchment with reform. In particular, firstly, measures should, as far as possible, contribute to the revival of economic activity and employment. Secondly, the measures should, as far as possible, be developmental, in that they should strengthen the foundations of Ireland's complementary economic and social development. Thirdly, it should be possible to explain how the chosen tax, expenditure and other policies are as fair as possible. And finally, adjustments should, as far as possible, put Ireland on a path that is sustainable economically, socially and environmentally. Thank you very much.
The distribution of wealth in a society more or less reflect the power relation in the same society. This year, 2010, is the European year for combating poverty and social exclusion. And they have slogans like building and Europe for all. And as all of us know, what has happened during this year so far is an enormous increase in poverty, enormous increase in exclusion. So once again, I have to link up to what I said earlier today. There is no link between what they say and what the political goals are and what the real development is. Inequality and poverty is increasing all over Europe, including in the Nordic models that is so successful. We also, I think, agree on many things. We agree that the redistribution from the bottom to the top and from labor to capital was an important part of the driver of the financial crisis. I think also that everybody agree on the need for redistribution of wealth. So I'm not going to talk about anything of that. I'm going to talk about how are we going to achieve it. And I will do that just by giving you 4 quotations. So if I get it, this is the first one. Richard Thorne, he was a British Labour politician. He was a writer, economist, historian. He started to work with poverty early, and he was pretty moralistic in his first phase of his life. But after a while, he became more and more aware of that this was systemic problems. So he had this excellent quotation that I think gave us a lot of insight in the problem, is that the problem of poverty is to be studied first at its sources and only secondly in its manifestations. And I think most of the society today are focusing purely on its manifestations and use very little resources in going into the sources for poverty. And I think that is what we have to do, because, as I said, it reflects power relations in society. A Norwegian professor, historian, Annelise Seip, she has written the Norwegian history of the Norwegian welfare state. She said the following on this question of poverty and welfare. The discussion on the justification of the welfare state and the causes of poverty is a disguised debate on the economic system in a society, whether the participants acknowledge it or not. So it's a systemic problem we are facing. The third quotation is from an American economist, McKenzie, from the University of California, I think. He said, McKenzie counsels that public spending on redistributive social benefits should be contemplated with the utmost care. Otherwise, officials and policymakers can expect to find the fiscal troubles mounting as capital moves elsewhere or is created elsewhere in the world. Those who are concerned about the plight of the poor must realize that there are economic limits to how much society can do for the poor, given the mobility of capital. He doesn't say that it is impossible to do something for the poor, but given the, we can say, free mobility of capital, there are limits on what we can do because of capital flight. That is, we do have sanctions today. Before the European Union and Commission are introducing sanctions against member states, we do already have sanctions on governments, and the sanction is given to financial capital. They can flee the country if they don't like the policy and the redistribution policies. So this is, we have to limit the power of capital. And my last one is to follow up on this Richard Wilkinson, who had this excellent book of the spirit level. In an interview a couple of years ago, we had the following, and it's a long quotation then, but he says what I think also is the correct thing. Well, he said, the quick solution, he was asked how we can solve these social problems and the problem of poverty and so on. But the quick solution, I suppose, if we want to reduce income inequality, is simply redistribution through taxes and benefits. The disadvantage of that, however, is that just as they can easily be made more progressive, providing better safety nets, so they can also be easily reversed by successive governments. It is important that greater equality should somehow be more built into the institutional structure of our societies in ways that is difficult for successive governments to undo. That means we need to be thinking much more fundamentally, for instance, about employee ownership or employee control of companies. The productive system is, after all, the source of wealth and the inequalities in its distribution. We need to find ways of democratizing economic life in as many ways as we can. We have to recognize that health inequalities are not going to be solved with some quick or easy solution which leaves most of the social system unchanged. So, the task is clear. We have to change the social system, the economic system which create poverty. It's hard work, but it's the only way. There is no quick fix. Thank you.
I'll also be brief given the limited time available. I think the crisis is an opportunity to rethink our entire growth model, and as part of that we need to think about inequality, primarily for two reasons. The first is that inequality was a major cause of the crisis, for reasons I won't now go into due to lack of time, and also because we're now looking at a further increase in inequality as a result of the crisis. So these things are sort of feeding on themselves. Initially, inequality is actually improved in the crisis because top incomes were hit more initially and wealth, but certainly with rising unemployment and cutbacks in the public sector, that is already changing in some countries and will certainly change in the coming years in others. So we need a whole set of policies to change that. I think there are probably six key areas I would suggest. The first priority is to get unemployment down. Right? We need macroeconomic policies, demand-side policies. These are not what people think about when you think of anti-poverty policies or equality-promoting policies. But the key driver of it, or a key driver of inequality, is unemployment. So we need, as was discussed in the previous session, to find ways, despite the fiscal constraints, of having expansionary macroeconomic policies. A second area would be to strengthen trade unions. We've seen a shift in income from labour to capital and from workers at the bottom of the labour market upwards within the working class. And one way to address both these things is to strengthen trade unions. We know from empirical studies that societies, European societies that have strong representative trade unions have compressed earnings differentials and lower inequality. And of course that's, so we need to address that. We need to widen the coverage of collective bargaining, notably. And that's partly, of course, a task for the trade union movement itself. But in the period before the neoliberal period, actually, national governments did quite a lot to strengthen the institutional power and role of trade unions in most European countries, and we need to find ways of doing that now after the crisis. A third area is particularly where trade unions are weak, so in countries where trade unions are weak, but also in areas of the economy where trade unions are weak. We need to have the state guaranteeing a floor in the labour market, notably in the form of minimum wages. Most EU states have statutory minimum wages. There's a number of exceptions, but most do. There's a big debate now in Germany about the introduction of statutory minimum wages, Germany being one of the prime exceptions to this norm that countries in the European Union have statutory minimum wages. Together with a German colleague, I've made a proposal for a minimum wage norm in Europe, which will be to at least 50%, if not 60%, of the average wage as the de facto minimum wage, either statutory or de facto minimum wage, and for this to be sort of monitored in one of these open methods of coordination type processes at the European level to encourage governments to move towards that goal. Fourthly, and I am aware that this is a sort of Blairite policy, but certainly I do think education is an important role. If you essentially reduce the supply of unskilled labour and increase the supply of skilled labour, you shift the relative scarcities. And I do think this is an important progressive agenda. That the problem was that this under the third way became sort of the only way that the centre left thought it could fight inequality, and that's certainly not the case. But I do think it's an important area. Now, most of the things I've talked about up until now have been about, if you like, influencing market incomes. Of course, there is then the issue of after-tax incomes and the tax and benefit system. I think here the problem is, and to this extent I agree with Asbjørn, the problem is how to reverse the trends that we've seen in a situation where capital is mobile, where sort of even within the European Union, states or governments perceive themselves as sort of implicitly being in competition, one state with the other. I mean, that competition has been very noticeable. We've seen a decline in the average top rate of income tax in the European Union. In the mid-90s, it used to be around 50%. It's now 42.4%, so we've lost almost 10 percentage points on the average top rate of income tax. Similar decline in the rate of corporation tax. I know corporation tax is a sensitive issue in this country, but certainly we're seeing this process of competition whittling away these tax bases. So we need, I think it's one of the many issues where we need European solutions, cooperation between states to close tax loopholes, to prevent harmful tax competition, prevent capital also fleeing and top incomes also fleeing to tax havens outside of the European Union. I mean, we shouldn't forget that we've had, we used to have, as it were, living memory, very high, punitive tax rates on very high incomes, and I think we should really be putting that on the debate. So not middle class incomes, but really these top incomes of CEOs and people in the financial industry, notably, to get back a debate about having really very extreme, very high tax take on these on these top incomes. We also need to think about other sources of tax income that's been mentioned also in other sessions that aren't taxes on labour, essentially. Wealth and inheritance taxes will be a prime contender, in my view. Property and land taxes, and of course a financial transactions tax, as Pervenche Perez has already argued for very, very forcefully. I mean, one of the litmus tests, I think, of the claim even made by Conservatives to fairness in the consolidation packages is it's the last point. Is whether the consolidation is on the spending or on the revenue side, and I think the progressive answer is very clear that we need to have the consolidation mostly on the revenue side. The last point is then the benefit system. I'm being told to shut up, so I will. But fairly clearly, we need to find ways of expanding the benefit coverage to the disadvantage in society in ways that don't harm work incentives and create some of the problems we have had in some of the benefit systems in our countries. So, thank you.
One of the comments that I want to make is about the use of the word fairness in any kind of discussion like this, because I think fairness is an emotive word, and I think that the people who availed of huge tax breaks in this country that allowed them to amass a great deal of wealth over the last decade or so thought that was a very fair thing to do. And somebody's tax break that I don't get is not fair to me. So I don't like the word fairness being used. I think what we need are things that we need to use words like equality, because you can measure equality. So in any discussion like this, rather than use the word fair, I'd rather use the word equal or equality, because I don't think that fairness is a word that you can pin down very easily.
This man here in the front.
Questions I have. Do we have a body of evidence on the impact of worker ownership or worker directorships in really large companies? I mean, does it work in terms of narrowing the income divide? And if so, is that because it raises the floor, or does it haul CEOs back down to out of the orbit of Mars or whatever it is? And is there a reason why you wouldn't go beyond sort of employee ownership to talk about customer ownership in that kind of an idea of a cooperative model? That if I spend money in a business by purchasing their goods and services, at the end of the year when the surplus comes to be redistributed, I would have a share in it. And I think it's worth just noting that the European Anti-Poverty Network has a proposed directive out at the moment for discussion and has support of 2 member states already in relation to a minimum adequate income. And in the discussion around that and the explanation of what they were at, in the current legal situation in the European Union with the Lisbon Treaty now in force, there were a couple of points about it. One is that it has to target sort of areas that are not prohibited or excluded by the Lisbon Treaty, one of which actually is national policies on pay. And I'm just wondering whether Andrew's point about looking at a sort of a pay norm and the open method of coordination or something like it has taken account of that exclusion. Is it an alternative? Is it a complementary? Or what stage is the thinking on that?
James Wickham. I want to make 2 sort of uncomfortable points, if you like, about the nature of inequality during the boom years, because I think these raise issues for how we talk about equality today. I mean, the first point is that one of the surprising things about the boom was the extent to which the full Irish workforce was not in fact mobilised. We had the bizarre situation of actually quite low levels of employment despite a tight labour market, and that was largely to do with the lack of policies, a combination of things, ranging from lack of childcare facilities through to an astonishingly casual attitude to benefits for most of the time. And you know, that's a bit uncomfortable to say, and you know, you don't really want to say it in public, but people have been pointing this out. You know, the levels of active labour market policies in the boom were by international standards very, very low. So actually what you had in the boom was in certain areas of the country a bread and circuses. There was enough income wealth being generated to maintain benefits at a civilized level, but not actually pushing people into the labour market. You know, that's the first thing. The second thing, which I think is much more important now, is that one of the consequences of the boom in Ireland and in the UK, I find the same thing, a growing financialisation. And what this actually means is a growing number of people who have financial assets. The very simple thing is that most people own cars. But people, home ownership, pensions, the privatisation of pensions, the enormous expansion of property, going right down into the sort of middle layers of society, the second home, the buy-to-let, all these sorts of things. And what this means is that, quotes, ordinary people now have wealth. The point, of course, is that when you compare it to the wealth at the top, it's utterly trivial. But it makes for a different landscape. And I think people on the left, I think progressives, we have to be aware of this. So, full stop. I mean, I just think these are problems which we will be foolish to ignore.
I'll just respond to a couple that were probably more directed at what I said. The first was the point about fairness, which I think is a valid point to make. It is a more emotive term. But I do think that from a very young age, we all know what fairness is and what it means to be fair. So on that basis, I'd argue that it's still a valid term to use, but it is more difficult to measure. The other point was just to respond to what James Wickham said, and certainly I'd agree about the active labour market policies, that I don't think that we were as active there as we might have been, and I think that's also reflected in an OECD review by Grubb, who looked at how we dealt with engagement with people who are unemployed, and he felt that was casual, to say the least, and disconnected as well, that people were streamlined into one agency or one government department or another, and it was very difficult for them to integrate across, depending on what their needs might be. And just to say that the NESC are actually preparing a policy report on activation at the moment that looks at some of those issues, and indeed the changing nature of people who are unemployed now in Ireland as a result of the recession. It's very different from what it would have been a few years ago. We hope to publish that, if not before Christmas, certainly soon afterwards. Thank you.
I just want to make one point. I don't know if that was a question, but I want to add it anyway, because what we have seen in Western Europe, also in America over the last 20 years, is this the change from welfare to workfare. And this workfare policy is a sort of individualization of the problem of being excluded from the labor market. So everything is sort of focused around the individual, each individual who are excluded. We have had a very, very strong campaign and a lot of discussion on that in Norway. In Norway, we have come up with this different notion which has been part of the discussion around this, namely the brutalization of work which is going on. The increasing demand on people, the increased pressure with more competition in the market, work intensity is increasing and all that. And this contributes to exclude ever more people out of the labor market. While the right-wing parties is focusing completely and one-sidedly on one reason for that, namely the lack of work moral. So this is a very difficult question, because what they are trying to do is to cut benefits, to cut sick leave benefit, to cut all kind of benefits, because this is an incentive to keep people out of the labor market, they say. There is no research, there is no any knowledge-based conclusion behind that, and we have been developing quite a lot of argument and had very, very strong discussions on it. So far, I think we are leading the internal discussion we have in Norway on this. I haven't seen this discussion at the same level in other countries, but I think it's very, very important discussion, because it's whether we look at this problem as a systemic problem or as a moral deficiency of each individual. Thank you.
I would wonder if the panel could say anything in regards to the increased amount of debt to income ratio, and whether or not there's a danger that if that's not addressed, that any stimulus package could be dissipated by people servicing debt rather than spending in the economy. The other point is in regard to the over-centralisation of our economy. What it means is people feel powerless in regards to the economy. They feel that basically there's nothing they can do about the economy or have any input into how the economy is working, and whether it is necessary to sort of break that centralisation down into sort of local economies, whereby we can have political structures whereby the local communities can have a direct input into economic development within their areas. Deal with things like childcare, transport systems, training, and development of local industries and local services, and that type of thing.
Just one of the things that strikes me, I suppose, and over the last 10 years and through the partnership model, has been the destruction of civic society that has taken place, and particularly I think it's epitomised by the unions in the country and by ICTU and the like, and how they are compliant in the system that we have. In light of that, and it's kind of depressing to hear most of the speakers placing store on unions as being a way of coming out of this. I think we have a long way to go to try for them to restore their credibility in Ireland, so that we can get to that stage. And I would just like to ask, maybe, and I'd like to ask Mr. Wall, if he could suggest maybe 2 practical things that people could do on a very local level to try and democratise work and labour again, or for the first time maybe in Ireland, that we could do at our own local levels and our own local institutions, because I think we have to start at that basis at this stage, and it's a very long-term project that we're going to be working on to try and recover some ground.
I have a question for the panel, for the Irish member in the panel, because in the Parliament, as I mentioned yesterday, I've been dealing with the Dell case, where you had so many fired people, and you had no trade unions in this US plan to have a proper negotiation. And so I think this is the first stage for any inclusive recovery. Then on the more European level, because this is still related, even if I understand that you need to act local, but you need not only to act local, you need to make sure you have a multi-level engagement to make sure you have this inclusive recovery strategy. And there I think it's more than important that we claim to have the proper figure, because at the EU level, when it comes to poverty today, we are working on poverty figure coming out from start 2007. So this means the lack of figure concretely translate for me the lack of engagement to use this figure and to have the proper figure. And in the same field, I also believe if we, following what we said in the plenary session, people combating for proper income equality and demand, they need to push the door and to make sure that the finance minister listen to you. And this is true at the national level, but this is also true at the EU level, because otherwise you have finance minister deciding without any consultation of anybody that it's time to get rid of the non-conventional social measure that were taken in the middle of the crisis. And third point is just regarding this minimum income, minimum income proposal. Let's not be tracked by the Lisbon Treaty. In the Lisbon Treaty, there are proper engagement by the EU to combat social exclusion. And now you have this 2020 strategy when we are asking as one of the 5 objectives that have been settled, one is about combating poverty. And if we just have this objective and we don't go further to have, the EU should not deliver in each and all detail of such a proposal, but you need to have a framework proposal to make sure that in each member state you could have such a strategy for an income revenue, taking into account the living standards and the prices in each member state. But I think this is a proposal we really need to take on board.
Okay, I just want to make a quick point, and it's about the national minimum wage. Sorry, it's Ursula Barry here. I think that one of the things that has created some level of protection in the crisis that we've been experiencing in this country has been that the national minimum wage has been statutory. So it's difficult for government to repeal it. They can freeze the level of it, which of course they have done for the last 2 years. But I suppose I want to caution about I want to put a note of caution into the idea of an EU-wide minimum wage or minimum standard, because at the moment Ireland's minimum wage would still be at the higher end, nominally at the higher end of the European spectrum. And I would be concerned that there would be an emphasis on kind of a pressure to average downwards, you know, and not really take into account standards of living and, you know, not take into account the real level at which the minimum wage operates. Because I think in any situation like that, there's already pressure within the recession context in Ireland to down the level of the national minimum wage. The employers are lobbying for that all of the time. And if there was an emphasis at a European-wide system, I think that could add, it has the potential to add to a pressure to average downwards. Okay. And that would be my worry. So that we need to have something like, you know, a minimum of a minimum wage, you know, a minimum level within which the minimum wage would operate, and then have a range connected to standards of living and so on. But so I'd be just careful about how that could be used.
I can respond immediately to that last point. The proposal is for to have a minimum wage in each country which is 50 or 60% of the national average wage, right? So it's keyed into the you know, the relationships in the economy in question. So I don't see that as an issue. I mean, I just perhaps pick up the point that the chair made about having a wider view on inequality than just income. I think that's an important point. I mean, one of the points I didn't have time to make is about the provision of universal public services, and I think that's a key a way to promote equality in a wider sense in our societies, to ensure that, you know, certain services are given to all citizens irrespective of their income. And then different countries can, you know, disagree and have their own values as to how broad that provision is. But that's a key issue. I think one of the concerns is, for example, that you know, if you marketize services, notably education, you know, if education becomes something you can buy on the market, that sort of ossifies inequality also over generations, and you get these sort of it becomes very difficult to have mobility. You know, you end up in the same sort of income category as your parents, just because you can't break out of that. And so I would emphasize that point about universal public services.
Just a short comment on this minimum wage. For your information, the Norwegian trade union movement is against the principle of minimum wage. That's because we feel strong enough to control the wage level through the collective agreements that we have. We still have 53% of unionization in Norway, and we still cover all sort of industries with collective agreements. So employers' association in the private services industry that have demanded to have a minimum wage in Norway, because I think they realize what they can pressure it. I was asked about the two concrete things which could be done at a local level, because it will take some time to do these bigger things that we have to do in order to eradicate poverty. I think it's very important that we separate the two things. One thing is to help the poor, the other thing is to eradicate poverty, and that are two completely different things. But what we could do is, we have done with some kind of success in Norway to force the municipalities, the public sector, to create jobs for people that is marginalized in the labor market. That has been done also through local mobilization against the municipalities and so on. Another thing is to include and organize the excluded and poor people into the alliances that we are building in order to pressure for other policies. A third thing is to campaign for social housing. I don't know what the situation in this country is, but in Norway, the social housing policy is more or less eradicated over the last 30 years. But I think we have been pushing very hard in order for municipalities to have subsidized good social housing for people, so that they can have a stable situation in this regard. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Just to go back, firstly, somebody mentioned whether the debt-to-income ratio is a concern, and yes, I think it is. Secondly, about the over-centralisation of our economy and the role of local economies, yes, I do think there is a role for local economies. I think how we organise that, though, is a key question, which I don't have time to go into now. And the third point to make is in relation to a number of commenters from the floor who talked about the involvement of unions and so on. And as a social partnership organisation, our council is comprised of the social partners and government departments. I'd have to say that the value of that from our perspective is to try and get some kind of shared analysis. Now that has been difficult obviously in the recent context, but I do think that is a valuable contribution. If you can get a shared analysis, then you can get some consensus on potential solutions. And the second part of that is who's the membership of a social partnership. And I think that's something that we may need to look at in terms of ensuring that it's as inclusive as possible.
I'll say something slightly contradictory, which is that I think in the last 10, 15 years we've seen a culture of where dissent is effectively has been not allowed and demonised in many respects. And I would have been part of the social partnership process as well, and I think an awful lot of good came and a lot of benefit flowed from that process, but the danger, of course, or the downside was that it did actually limit and minimise any form of alternative critiques, and I think that's some of that is a failure on our part of those who were in the process and also those who were maybe on the edge of it. And I think that unions and the community sector and the world of academia, some of these things were mentioned earlier on, is now challenged to, I think, to re-harness and recapture acceptable levels of dissent and critique and forward thinking and vision that actually and a shared analysis about the future of what we want society to be. And I think we're all challenged in that respect. I'm going to go back to
my name's Maureen Gilbert. I'm very interested in this business of who we're actually talking about, because it seems to me that for most of the time we've been talking about people who are considered to be part of the labour force. And there are a lot of people at the moment who are excluded from being in the labour force, and that proportion of people is likely to be increased, it seems to me, and that falls in particular places each time. I was really intrigued at my own reaction to the announcement in the UK that no family would have benefits that were greater than the average industrial wage. And for about 5 minutes, I found myself agreeing with it until I thought about it. And I think that's where the sort of fairness thing comes in. It seemed fair for about 5 minutes, until I started thinking about the additional costs of disability, for argument's sake, and the way in which people actually are different and their requirements are different. And there are so many different groups, of whom people with disabilities in Ireland are only one, who are really only considered through social protection measures and through the availability of public services and so on. And it seems to me that the more that we talk, maybe not the more that we talk. As we're talking, it feels like, and I'm sure this is unintentional, but it feels like recovery and all of these things are somehow related to being part of the labour market, and that if you're not part of the labour market for whatever reason, that somehow that means you're part of the problem rather than part of the solution. I think that's what I'm trying to say. And in so doing, I think we create even more dissension and even more of the potential for an authoritarian response. And equally, I'm not being very clear. If we follow that path, what you wind up with is a set of responses and a set of social services in which there is no choice. There's a sort of basic minimum, and you take it or you leave it. And that in itself, by disenfranchising people's lives, increases the possibilities for an authoritarian end. I'm sorry I wasn't very clear about that.
Thanks a million. This woman here, and then
Catherine Murphy, I'm on the board of TASC and public representative in Kildare. Just a few points. We're at the same time as we're trying to build towards recovery and try and get an alternative view about inequality, we're also trying to build a mechanism to do that. And I think the point that has been made earlier about the role of the trade union movement in particular in buying into the partnership model has obviously where they bought influence, they lost power, and the nature of the particular government or particular philosophy obviously was a huge problem, to say the least. So we don't have the same mechanism for dealing with things in terms of the trade union movement being a credible progressive group to lead us out as maybe other European countries do. And there's a rebuilding job needed to be done there. The second point I want to make is when we talk about fairness and we talk about property, I think we have to look at the nature of property. There's a huge number of people who put a roof over their heads who actually own debt. They don't own property. And I think we've got to differentiate between the two. Okay. The third thing is, I think it would be quite useful if somebody could describe what a financial transaction tax would look like at a micro level. Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
I'm Anastasia quickly. We were talking earlier about putting the political back into economy, and now we're trying to interrogate solutions. And I'd just like to kind of try to link the two a bit. First of all, Ashbourne reminded me when you talked about the European Year Against Poverty of yet another silo. We talk about poverty and exclusion as if they've nothing got to do with racism, inequality, the whole business of not dealing with the areas of inequality and oppression that are experienced by people with disabilities, and including gender inequality in our society. So I think if we're beginning to shift and make a paradigm shift, we can't any longer talk about these things in isolation. The people experiencing the worst poverty on the ground are probably people who are migrants or who are Roma or travellers in this country. So I think the key to some of this I'd suggest to you is the business of linking together concepts that have been previously understood very separately, intellectualized very separately, except they're not blooming well experienced separately on the ground. They're experienced in exactly the same space by the most marginalised people. And we need to legislate for some of them as well, and it's got to do with linking economic, social and cultural rights, along with civil and political ones. Secondly, I like the notion of ordinary people now having wealth, and you're dead right about that, James. But what I'm interested in asking you from Norway, Ashburn, is ordinary people in Nordic countries also had some wealth, you know, and it didn't stop them from entering into some form of solidarity. I know that's disentangling itself now, but it didn't stop them from entering into it, and I'd be interested in your thoughts about that. And you also spoke about alliances, and Andrew was speaking about the need to strengthen trade unions' collective bargaining. To be honest with you, it seems to me that and I don't blame entirely trade unions, as someone who is also from the community sector, somewhat a part of social partnership, I don't think we should blame people for what they did. But I think what's happened is that we are part of silos as well in these sectors. And I feel we need to be careful about workplace rights as articulated by trade unions trumping other rights articulated by different groups. And it seems to me that the alliances we're talking about have to have what we call in this country parity of esteem, if we're not to end up fighting with one another rather than moving forward together to try to make the paradigm shift that can recreate thinking. And a concern I would have about trade unions, and I speak as someone who's always been a member of a trade union, is that I think trade unions in Europe and throughout Europe are more concerned with individual workplace rights, and it's no harm that they are, it's a very important thing to be concerned about, than with the sort of collective shift that needs. Because if I was talking about things now, you know, we've talked about rights, we talk about recognition, but I think we need to stop talking about redistribution and talk a good deal more about reorganisation, you know, because if you say that, you look as if you're an old-fashioned Maoist or something like that. And I do feel that, you know, we have to start using different sorts of language. And lastly, Helen, I suppose, you know, I was interested in what you were saying, but one of the things that strikes me about entities like NESC, and I suppose this is a question to you, how can NESC become part of the paradigm shift? Given the composition that you've landed out to us there, that's your board, you know, what sort of space can things like NESC make? Or is it inevitable that what you come up with will be just stretching the elastic rather than letting go of it and moving into another space? You know, how can we use these instruments in a way that's more efficient and effective? Or do we just need to let go of it?
Just the discussion about the minimum wage, I think the other side of that, and it's I think a concept that was looked at in the spirit level, is the maximum wage and what's the maximum income. And I think perhaps the question to the panel is, what's the possibility of that, and could it at least initially be explored within the public sector? Because I think that's part of the problem around the what happened even with the Croke Park Agreement, is we have the top civil servants retained their income, and I think that was an issue there, and you know, the concept of 100,000 or something was put on that. The other issue is around employment, and I think it is true that particularly in disadvantaged communities, the employment during the Celtic Tiger in the areas of trades, the construction industry, various areas did provide a big boost to people. The problem is now they're the first ones who've all lost their jobs, and these communities have been hit straight away. And the question is around what sort of initiatives can be put in place to give people employment in these situations. And there is models there already, like the community employment scheme, like the community development projects, which of course have been cut, but just that question. Finally, around what David Begg said, I think when you refer to the issue of mobilisation being a case of mayhem on the streets and cars being burned, no one's asking for that. We're talking about broad expressions of opposition and expression of alternatives. And again, the question, how can we express those forms of struggle, of social struggle that you say are necessary?
2 points to finish. First of all, I think it's very healthy to have such a debate as we're having here today, so I don't feel that I need to defend any particular positions. And the second point is the question that I was asked directly about how can NESC contribute towards a paradigm shift. And the way we work is that we do analysis in the Secretariat, which is presented to the Council members, usually for some kind of discussion and subsequent consensus agreement. But of course we also publish research papers which comprise only the analysis without necessarily having to reach a consensus agreement. So there is the opportunity to use that analysis by groups such as yourselves and others to kind of, if they support arguments or to challenge arguments. So it's a kind of an independent resource. Thank you.
The problem with, for example, the European Union is that there is no connection between the different sections of politics in a way. When they, on the one hand, say that they are fighting poverty and exclusion. On the other hand, all the economic policy which they are pursuing is creating poverty. So we have to link these different areas to each other. And we shouldn't let them go away with this. The situation in Europe today is, last figure I saw is that 14% of the workforce in the European Union today is so-called working poor. That was 10 years ago an American phenomenon. I think 10 years ago, at least I knew that the figure they used in the US was 15%, which had a full job and still couldn't finance the livelihood in the way. So that they had this has come to Europe, and it is exploding now. So the poverty is increasing among working people now. And I think that the trade unions, there's all been in my view that trade unions is an important and necessary part of the solution of these social problems, and not part of the problem. I realize that there are problems here and there, and trade unions are different, and we have weaknesses and so on. But in the end, they are unavoidable in a way, the trade unions. If they're not good enough, we have to make them good enough. And the most important thing, the contribution from my union this year in fighting poverty in Norway, was that we had a 2 to 3 week strike this in connection with a new national collective agreement the last spring. And we established a sort of a minimum level among municipal workers. But that means that people that have been a certain number of years in work should have at least 85% of the average wage in the municipalities. And that is the best thing we could do to fight poverty.
Andrew, any final comments?
Quickly, thank you. A couple of quick points. Maximum limits and things. I don't think this is the way forward. I think tax high pay is a better solution than imposing maximum limits on companies. Just a general point, I think, is really the need for European solutions. I mean, it's fine to criticise the European Union as it is, but it is the only way, I think, we can deal with regulation and improving our welfare, particularly for people at the bottom, in a situation of capital mobility. I'm not sure how else exactly one could envisage doing that, and we shouldn't forget that capital mobility also has its good points. Right? What we have seen in Europe, if you look at Europe as a whole, is actually quite an impressive convergence upwards on the part of Central and East European countries towards EU 15 averages. That's actually been quite an achievement of the European, partly due to capital mobility. So we don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. We want to keep that. But we want to restrict this sort of veto power of capital there. I do entirely agree with Asbjørn's line. They have a sort of veto power, and that's what we need to try and break. And it seems to me the way to do that is to strengthen the European level.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.